Good afternoon, everyone. How are you? All right, I need a little more oomph in your voices this afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. How are you? Fantastic. I love the different versions of that. It speaks to our Caribbean diversity and our unity. And we have some African Americans in the room this afternoon because today our panel is on Emancipation Reimagined. What is this word emancipation that has been bandied about for many, many years? What does that concept mean to us from the Caribbean, to those from the African American community? And we're going to have a conversation about how diverse that meaning and that understanding is this afternoon. So, first of all, I want to thank Camille Edwards, who is our programming committee chair, who has pulled all of this together this afternoon. Can we give her a round of applause, please? Thank you, Camille. To our volunteers, our Island Space team, thank you all for helping pull this together. And I always want to thank our funders. They are who allow us to make these types of events free for the community. So funding for this program was provided through a grant from the Florida Humanities with funds from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the following funds at the Community Foundation of Broward: Mary N. Porter Community Impact Fund, Jack Belt Memorial Fund, Ginny and Tom Miller Fund, Stearns Weaver Miller Fund for the Arts, and Harold D. Franks Fund. So, to set the tone, let me share with you that Island Space Caribbean Museum is the first and only Caribbean heritage museum in the world, as far as we know. How many of you is your first time here? Show of hands. Okay, quite a few people in the room. And those who have been here before know this story, right? We are the first and only. We are here to bring the entire Caribbean community together. And I'll share my story. When I came to this country, I told my sister I was coming to stay on her couch for 2 weeks, and I just never left. And the family that I started to develop here, I didn't come here to come to school, so I didn't have a school group, I didn't have a work group, I didn't have, anybody that I grew up with here. And so the family that became established for me was this Caribbean American family. It was not just the Jamaicans, it became the Haitians, it became the Trinis, everybody became family. And so being here for the past 20-some years, I felt the need to have a space that all of us could share and call home. And it's one of the most pleasant things that we hear. People come in here, oh my God, this is ours. Yes, it is ours. It belongs to you. It belongs to me. It belongs to all of us. So that's Island Space. And to set up for this afternoon's talk, we want to share with you 2 little quick videos. We like to set the mood. And these are some videos, one of which we have created at Island Space with the help of Makeda Solomon as Nanny of the Maroons, and the second is by an African-American poet.
Aquaba, Queen Grandinani, I am. The Maroons in Jamaica and the world, my clan. From a royal Asante liberty on the Gold Coast, I was snatched to a small tiny island where cruelty and wickedness I watched. To the hills we ran. Our destiny was not linked to chains. Till today, many of my people have them locked around their brains. 1720 to 39, the British tried in vain to crush our sovereignty plans, to live in cultural and spiritual freedom with ancestral guidance, not white man's. So when Brother Cudjoe signed the first British treaty, after they surrendered in 1739, I screamed in rage, "Abaya Jiko Jotwo!" Meaning the government had seized his gun, if not his mind. Yes, I worked supernatural wonders, healed with herbs in front of wide open eyes. Those devils smeared it as obeah with conspiracies and lies. Believe me, I would do it all over again. So now, I hear the spirits of my people sing. Bakra's face has changed, but he's now armed with new things. While my body might lay as carbon ashes at a place they call bump grave, but my spirit is all powerful, and my power still rage.
Subscribe to the Island Space YouTube channel and visit our website at islandspacefl.org to learn more.
Governor of Minnesota announcing that the state is launching a civil rights investigation into the Minneapolis Police Department. He says it is the first of many steps ahead to restore trust with the Black community.
I have a dream. Our dreams matter. Similar to Dr. Martin Luther King. No more hoping for things, no more broken wings. The measure of a man is more than bling and material things. A corporate slave ain't all what it seems. Minimum wage ain't no iron team. Our dreams matter. Not just for me as a man, but for my children, your children, our children, to stand hand in hand with the other man, like President Barack Obama and Senator Edward Kennedy. For human rights and civil liberties, a fair justice system and equal opportunity. 41 shots wasn't needed to shoot at me, throw me in a jail cell and sodomize me, hunt me down with a shotgun and murder me in the streets. 7 shots to the back, Kenosha, Milwaukee. Our dreams matter. Swap stickers and noose hanging, hang that nigga by a tree. Man, that white woman was looking at me. White silence and white violence. Our dreams matter. Not to turn the other cheek. To fight back, to fight with dignity. To fight with equal protection under the law for BIPOC communities. Our dreams matter. To stop the bloodshed in Kenya, bring our troops home from war. Open up those prison doors, put money into rundown schools, and help feed the poor. Our dreams matter. When one day we understand reverse racism is a myth. The bootstrap theory still exists. Equal economic opportunity for women isn't placed at the bottom of the list. Systematic oppression is more than just a wish list. I wish my dreams come true so I can scream from the mountaintop. Our dreams matter. Our dreams matter. Our dreams matter. Our dreams matter. We all have a collective duty to stand up and take action to address centuries of racism. It's not just Black Lives Matter responsibility, but all of our responsibilities, because our dreams matter.
So those were some depictions of various ideas of characters from our emancipation stories. If you're Jamaican, you know Nanny of the Maroons. She was one of our most recognized freedom fighters, and the same for Martin Luther King here in this country. And so I'm actually going to hand the microphone over to Dr. Rozalia Dr. Rozalia Williams, ED, and I'm going to give a brief bio of Dr. Williams. Dr. Rozalia Williams, ED.D., founder and president of the College of Student Development Center, Inc. in Hollywood, Florida. She's our moderator. She earned an ED.D. in Administration, Planning, and Social Policy from the Harvard University Graduate School of Education, and a Master of Science in Counselor Education from Florida International University. Dr. Rozalia, did I say? Rozalia, I did say it right the first time. Rozalia Williams, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here and to have the opportunity to have a place where we can come together and talk about issues of concern especially to the African American and Caribbean community. So as we appreciate our funders, we appreciate everyone who's affiliated with the, is this better? Everyone who's affiliated with the Island Space Museum. We have 3 objectives that the panelists and I are trying to accomplish today. The first one is to inform the audience on how African American and Caribbean people have evolved since slavery, to convey the African American and Caribbean perspectives on where we stand with equity and equality today, and to make recommendations on how we can effectively continue to improve our circumstances together. So what we're going to do is at the end of the discussion, and I know that it's going to be very thought-provoking, you're going to have questions. We're going to have a Q&A session. So there's going to be some cards, some index cards that we're going to pass out in order for us to be able to accommodate the most questions as possible. Write your question down because things are going to come to mind as the panelists make different points. And write your name and who the question is directed to. And when we get to the Q&A session, we will have an opportunity for you to speak in the mic, or the panelists will also know to whom to direct the questions. So at this point in time, I want to introduce the panelists, Mr. David Bynes. David Bynes is the co-founder of Bynes & Associates Consulting, an organization dedicated to building authentic relationships with clients by providing a suite of empowering personal and professional services. He's also the director of the Office of Social Justice and Inclusion at Florida International University. Prior to joining FIU, Mr. Bynes served as Associate Director for the Center for Inclusion, Diversity Education, and Advocacy at Florida Atlantic University, where he provided leadership for the Office of Diversity Education and Training. He also established the Office of Black Student Success and Initiatives to provide student engagement, support for achieving success, and community and cultural development to students of the African Black diaspora. Mr. Bynes received a Bachelor of Arts in Communication from Elon University, earned a Master of Education in Higher Education Administration from North Carolina State University, and is currently pursuing his Doctor of Philosophy in Teaching and Learning with a concentration in Curriculum, Cultural, and Social Studies at Florida International University. He's a specialist in diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice education and initiatives. And he has received training and development through the Social Justice Training Institute, the Anti-Defamation League, the National Conference of Race and Ethnicity, and the Racial Equality Institute. Welcome, Mr. Bynes. Our next panelist is Mr. Derek Davis. Derek Davis is a writer, history advocate, presenter, and storyteller who has a successful track record of creating and managing cultural programs and African-centered historical projects in South Florida for more than a quarter of a century. Currently, he is the manager of Davis Kuumba Arts, LLC. He is the president of the Trailblazers of Broward County, a member of the Broward County Historic Preservation Board, a member of the South Florida Association for the Study of African American Life and History, and the American Museum Alliance. Prior to retiring, he was the curator of the Broward County Public Schools Old Dillard Museum, a facility that is on the National Register of Historic Sites, where he produced gallery and virtual exhibits and managed community programs. He was the head of exhibits and programs at the African American Research Library and Cultural Center here in Broward County, which is the third public library in the nation to hold an extensive collection of African American, and Caribbean heritage. He was also the executive director of the Black Archives History and Research Center at South Florida, where he created partnerships and developed community outreach activities, cultural and educational programs, and exhibitions of local and regional interest. Welcome, Mr. Davis. Our next panelist is Mr. Glenn Joseph. Mr. Glenn C. Joseph is the president and CEO of Monroe Enterprises, Inc. and Monroe Associates Group, multidisciplinary consulting firms specializing in government relations, political consulting and management, international trade, international business development, government relations, and community outreach. He's the founding board member of the Caribbean Action Lobby in New York, an original member of the Caribbean American Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and a board member of the first Community Advisory Board of Medgar Evers College in Brooklyn, New York. He is president of World Care, Inc., director of the Cellulosic International Group, founding director and originating chairman of the Miami Broward One Carnival, and managing director of the Caribbean American Heritage Foundation. Mr. Joseph is the former president of the Trinidad and Tobago Chamber of Commerce, the former president and current treasurer of the South Florida chapter of the American Society for Public Administration, former president and chairman of the board for the Greater Caribbean American Chamber of Commerce and the Greater Caribbean American Cultural Coalition. He is the executive vice president of the Institute of Caribbean Studies and currently serves as the chairman of the Caribbean Democratic Caucus of Florida. He is a member of the Florida Democratic Party's Executive Committee, Campaign Committee, and Diversity and Inclusion Committee, where he served as the voter engagement lead. Thank you. Welcome. Our last panelist, the last introduction, is Dr. Nadine Wedderburn. Dr. Wedderburn is an associate professor of social science and public affairs in the School of Social and Behavioral Sciences at the State University of New York, Empire State College in Saratoga Springs, New York. She teaches sociology, public policy, public affairs, research methods, and statistics. Her current research is concentrated on exploring the historical foundations of public education in Jamaica with the aim of reinforcing the urgency to decolonize schooling in post-colonial societies. Her publications include Backlash, the primordial response to teaching critical race theory in the US and US history. And she co-authored Cultivating Home, Local Farms, Global Diasporas, and Transnational Labor, and the Immigration Debate, Implications for the Caribbean Diaspora. Throughout the years, she has made scholarly presentations on topics such as avoiding the illusion of inclusion, a comprehensive approach to teaching and learning the Black experience, humanizing teaching and learning, a call to decolonize schooling in Jamaica, critical race theory, is it what you think, Chant Down Babylon, Religion and Politics in Bob Marley's Lyrics, and Claiming the Health and Integrity of the Black Mind, Reflections on Joy DeGruy's Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. Dr. Wedderburn earned her doctorate in public affairs at Florida International University. She earned a master's in engineering management at the Florida Institute of Technology and a bachelor's in civil engineering technology at the Rochester Institute of Technology. What accomplishments. So we're going to start our discussion off today with some definitions. Well, before we do that, can you tell us a little bit about your heritage, your ancestry? Starting with David.
All right, good afternoon. I want to give honor to the ancestors that I know that are present with us, and definitely acknowledge that we are seated for this program on unceded territory of the Tequesta people, some would say the Taino people, and so we simply acknowledge them as well today. And so for me, I usually tell people that I am a Black identifying African, born and living in what is known as Turtle Island, and was colonized to be the United States of America by the colonizers, and I was born and raised in unincorporated Fort Lauderdale, not too far from here. Raised in an area a community known as Parkway. And today I live in the city of Lauderdale.
Okay, yeah. And I was born in Miami, in Overtown, by a midwife. I grew up in various parts of Dade County. At one time we lived in the Scott Projects. Later moved and lived in other parts of Liberty City. I've lived in Coral Gables. When I got some positions here, some of the positions you say, like at the African American Research Library, we moved to Miramar, so I'm living in Miramar now. My mother was from Titusville. My father was from Virginia. But since we're on a Caribbean thing and talking about Overtown and growing up in Overtown, there were so many Caribbean people around us that even though my parents were somewhere else, that we were always around Caribbean people. I still remember Miss Gibson that lived across the street from us that used to sell comforters and frozen cups to the neighborhood. So I feel that I've always been a part of a close, not a part, but a close to the Caribbean community.
Hello, everyone. I know we sit in hallowed ground here, and we have some distinguished people in the audience. I was born in the island of Trinidad and Tobago, in the north, where my mother, as a young bride, gave birth to me in Belmont. And then she went back to her husband's birthplace, which was Superior, Trinidad. I grew up in Superior, and at the tender age of 16, 17, I went into Port of Spain to be part of the National Youth Camp Service, where I spent a couple of years before migrating to the United States. I came to the United States as a 20-year-old, 19 going on 20, in 1970. And at that time, I was brought here to go to school. And I thought I was going to school. But the school that I went to wasn't the equivalent of our elementary schools. So I immediately had to make my way through this new country. I had to find a job because I didn't want to send home for money. So I found a job. I tell my kids I've worked every machine from a dishwashing machine to a computer. And I have had some experiences, which I'll get into later on. I then moved to New York, where I spent almost 36 years in New York. Moving from New York, I went to school on a scholarship to the University of New Haven on a soccer scholarship. And from there, I went back down to New York, where I finally moved to Florida in 1994. And my experiences through all of that really has fueled my intensity when I look at the emancipation discussion, when I look at the intense problems that our kids are having now in terms of the assimilation into the system and the political discourse. But I'll get into all of that later on. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'm Nadine Wedderburn. I am Jamaican of African ancestry, born and raised in a place called St. Anne on the north coast of the island. And I currently reside in Schenectady, New York, originally occupied by the Mohawk and Mohican nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy.
Thank you all. And in terms of my heritage and ancestry, my father was born in Nassau, Bahamas. I'm a Bahamian American, of African descent. My mother was born in Dublin, Virginia, and my father came to America. He studied at Tuskegee Institute, and my mother in Virginia, when she grew up, it was illegal to educate blacks beyond 6th grade. So my grandparents sent her to a private school, and both of their accomplishments are now documented at their accomplishments at Tuskegee and in Virginia are documented in the National Museum of African American History in Washington, D.C. So let's start out with a little brief historical timeline of emancipation in the U.S. and the Caribbean. Mr. Davis, I understand emancipation in Florida occurred today, May 20th. Can you give us a brief timeline of the Emancipation Proclamation in the U.S. and when it was announced in Florida?
Yes, and remember, emancipation is a process, and that process began when in 1862, when Abraham Lincoln wrote this proclamation to the Confederate states, the states that had rebelled, that if they did not return, well, he gave them a time frame. He said, if you don't return to the United States, the Union, by the 1st of January, that we are going to implement emancipation for all the people in your area. So if we take over an area, we're going to emancipate the black people of that area, and we're not going to compensate you for that. Now, the reason that part is very important is because there were states that were considered slave states that were part of the Union, and there were already efforts started to have them to emancipate their black people, but they got compensated for that emancipation. But he gave them a couple of months from September until January 1st to make that decision. And I mention that because when I was growing up in a lot of the black churches, they would have a New Year's service, a watch night service. And it was not, and they didn't really tell the children, but that service did not start off to celebrate the New Year. It celebrated the watch night services that black people had all across the United States, waiting to see if Lincoln was really going to implement the Emancipation Proclamation. So January 1st is one of the important days of that emancipation process. And on January 1st, he did sign it, and there was jubilation through a lot of the churches, the free churches and the other blacks who now felt that they could actually become a part of the fighting, of the war, because it now became, we can free our people because of that war. And because it was a process, the process was, as the Union Army takes over an area, we free the blacks in that area. Immediately, there were many places where the Union Army had already taken over some of the sites in the South. They were holding many black people at what they call contraband. During the other part of the war, as the Union Army would come near a place, the slaves would escape, or the black people would escape and come to the Union camps. And many times the Union generals would not know what to do with them, would want to turn them back over. And so they came with this idea of these contraband camps, because they were still considering black people as property, and that they were holding on to property that didn't belong to them. So immediately when Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, it meant that those people now were free, they're no longer contraband, they should be treated as citizens. During the process of the war, as they were taking over areas, they would free additional black people in those areas. I one time did a calculation, and I just say, during the time of the war, about 1,000 black people were saved every day as they were fighting. And other thing about the Emancipation Proclamation, it settled an argument about whether black people can even fight in the Union Army. So you actually had black people now joining the Union Army to be a part of that struggle to free their people. Now, at the end of the war, in 1865, there were 2 states where the Union Army had never taken over the capitals. Did not have a very big presence, had lost, and one of them, they had lost a lot of battles to try to take over the capital. And those 2 states were Florida and Texas. So those 2 states were arguing that because the war is over, because the president is assassinated, because you never took us over, then you cannot free our people because of the Emancipation Proclamation. It was a presidential executive order. That war is over. That president is dead. He was assassinated. So we should keep our, we should not have to use the Emancipation Proclamation to free our black people, which meant that if you do free our black people, you need to compensate us. So it was decided that instead of that, that they would send Union generals out to those 2 states to take over their capitals. And in Florida, that happened on May 20th, 1865. In Texas, that happened on June 19, 1865. So that's what we say, Juneteenth. But that process actually started in Florida and then moved on to Texas.
Thank you so much for that background on where we're coming from when nationally now, and in some places it's a national holiday, Juneteenth. Dr. Wedderburn, tell us about emancipation in the Caribbean.
All right, thank you. To set up the timeline of emancipation in the Caribbean, if you will, I'd like to first situate the Caribbean, to acknowledge that the Caribbean, when we speak of the Caribbean, we're acknowledging the Caribbean as space, place, and identity. Growing up in Jamaica, I learned in school that the Caribbean is the set of islands washed by the Caribbean Sea. Looking at a map, we see that, strictly speaking, this includes the archipelago of islands stretching from Cuba in the north to Trinidad and Tobago in the south. In addition, countries like Belize, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Panama, Colombia, and Venezuela, though they are parts of other mainlands, have shores that are also washed by the Caribbean Sea. In addition, we have to the south, South American mainland territories of Guyana, Suriname, and French Guyana, who also assert Caribbean identity, along with the Bahamas and Turks and Caicos, even though by right they are located in the Atlantic Ocean. So treat that as a roll call of sorts to kind of call us together. Speaking of the Caribbean historically, is to tell a story of centuries-long colonization, and yet the story does not begin there. It doesn't begin with the arrival of European interlopers. The indigenous inhabitants of the area included groups like the Taínos, Maya, Inca, Aztecs, Arawaks, and Caribs, the people after whom the region is named. And there are still Caribs living in some parts of the Caribbean today. Places like St. Vincent, Honduras, and Belize, they refer to themselves as Garifuna. So big up any Garifunas in the audience. And their existence, the fact that they are still with us, speaks to their characteristic spirit of resistance, which we'll get into some more, that helped to fight off European invaders and avoid their total annihilation. To speak of the Caribbean is to speak of the Dutch colonization of Aruba, Bonaire, Curaçao, St. Eustatius, Saba, the one half of the island of St. Martin, and Suriname on the continent of South America. Aruba, Curaçao, and St. Martin are constituent countries within the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and the other islands are what are called special municipalities of the Netherlands. To speak of the Caribbean historically is also to speak of Spanish colonization, including Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Dominican Republic. Cuba and the Dominican Republic are autonomous independent countries. Puerto Rico, as we know, is an unincorporated territory of the United States. And of course, to speak of the Caribbean historically is to refer to the English-speaking Caribbean, those nations formerly or still colonized by England or the US. That is, countries making up what is known as the British Commonwealth Caribbean and the Virgin Islands, which are still US colonies today. There are 19 countries in the Caribbean currently that have English as their official language. So we're talking about centuries of colonization that has completely transformed the society of the Caribbean as we know it, coming from the languages that we speak, to the way we cook our food, to the music that we enjoy, to different cultural forms of expression. So given this background, it is clear that present-day Caribbean is a region entirely structured on European imperialism and settler colonialism, with a history not much different from the territory that was formed into what we now refer to as the United States. Connections to Africa, European colonization, and slavery have indelibly defined the culture and character of the region and its family. So why did I get into all of that? Because on the heels of colonization came the institution of slavery. And so consequently, the process of abolition in the Caribbean was complex and varied, depending on the island or the place that was colonized by a particular imperial power. Arguably, the catalyst that began the anti-slavery movement towards justice in the Caribbean was the Haitian Revolution, carried out by self-liberated Africans against French colonizers on the island of Saint-Domingue, as the country was called then. The revolution lasted from 1791 to 1804 and successfully ended with the declaration of Haiti as the first post-colonial independent black-led nation in the world, and the only nation whose independence was gained as part of a successful slave rebellion. I know we will get into talking more about agency and resistance, but to again set up our conversation insofar as the Caribbean is concerned. The Haitian Revolution inspired many other slave uprisings across the Caribbean. As the former Prime Minister of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago and eminent scholar Sir Eric Williams wrote in his book From Columbus to Castro, I quote, "In 1804, when Haitian independence was declared, it seemed as if there is only one way of attaining the rights of men in the Caribbean, by a slave revolution from below," end of quote. Meanwhile, in other countries like Jamaica, as we've seen with our video earlier, similar acts of resistance were being waged by Maroons against English colonists during the 18th century. The original Maroons were the descendants of a band of enslaved people who had escaped from Spanish slave owners and had taken refuge in the mountainous interior of the island. And we may know about the Baptist War, also known as the Sam Sharp Rebellion in Jamaica, or the Christmas Rebellion, that occurred from 1831 to 32. An 11-day rebellion that started on the 25th of December, 1831, and involved up to 60,000 of the 300,000 slaves in the colony of Jamaica. And it's important to note that slavery was not abolished immediately, or just like in the US, it wasn't a smooth process. There were several attempts made to prolong the experience of enslaving African people in the Caribbean, whether it was through amelioration acts and policies or even apprenticeship that happened after the official abolition. So just to bring the timeline to an end, the abolition of the slave trade, that is the trafficking of Africans across what we now refer to as the Middle Passage, was abolished first. The thinking was, if we can abolish the slave trade, then we might be able to prolong the institution of slavery. If we can ameliorate, if we can improve the conditions of enslaved people. That was the actual wording of the legislation, improve the conditions. So the intention was never to abolish slavery. First, the slave trade was abolished by Denmark in 1803. If you remember, the Haitian Revolution ended when? Very good. Great Britain abolished the slave trade in 1807. Holland in 1814, the French in 1818, the Spanish in 1820, and Sweden in 1827. And although the abolition of the slave trade was enacted, transportation and selling of enslaved people continued for years after. Over the next 2.5 decades, the slavery as an institution was in trouble under the pressure of a general resistance by enslaved people. Eventually, slavery was abolished by the British in 1833. Sweden followed suit in 1846. France in 1848, Brazil in 1850, Holland in 1863, Puerto Rico in 1873, and Cuba in 1886. So if you do the math, you see how long and protracted this so-called abolition of slavery took place.
Thank you very much. Both you and Mr. Davis have talked about emancipation in the context of a legal act, the signing of documents, the executive order, and an administrative function. I want to continue with you, Dr. Wedderburn. There's a dictionary definition, the legal definition, and there's also the lived experience of emancipation, which you talked about. What's the difference between emancipation and the abolition of slavery from your viewpoint?
Really good question. I contend that there is a difference between abolition and emancipation. And I refer to my notes regularly because I want to be sure I don't miss any points. But we will have conversation later for sure. So even though the terms emancipation and abolition tend to be used interchangeably, abolition of slavery refers to the legal ending of an institution, the ending of a system, a particular system that served to organize society in very specific ways. And I'll talk a little bit about what that system did to society. So slavery in the Caribbean defined the entire social structure of society. So much so that historians consider the Caribbean to be one of the 5 major slave societies. In the Caribbean slave society that developed around the need for a large workforce on plantations after the decimation of indigenous people and the limited utility of white indentured servants, Africans considered chattel, which means property, possessed to be exploited by and produce unpaid labor for white European enslavers, were placed in the lowest position of the social hierarchy. So this system organized society according to one's status, who was owned versus who owned, who was free versus who was enslaved. And according to this structure, richly melanated skin at once signified bondage, inferior, heathen, and owned, while white skin signified free, superior, Christian, and owner. Indeed, all aspects of slave society, including family, religion, and government, revolved around the system of slavery, with an economy driven by the blood, sweat, and tears of labor from African bodies. So abolition refers to the rendering of this particular order of society illegal, It outlawed the means by which people's status was defined in society. Abolition of slavery was a legal action that produced legal consequences. It was a legislative response to the political, social, humanitarian, and economic pressures of the time. It was a structural strategy. Emancipation, I contend, on the other hand, is a more holistic expression of freedom that involves the physical as well as the psychological well-being of a person. It certainly has historical significance. For example, when we talk about the Emancipation Proclamation, but to my mind, whereas abolition refers to the declaration of freedom, emancipation is the realization of freedom. Freedom and control over one's life. Freedom and control to make your own choices and to live life on your own terms. Abolition, to me, does not carry the power of emancipation. Abolition is concerned with a system, but emancipation is concerned with the individual. Abolition is what is granted by a system. Emancipation is what you give to yourself.
Okay. Anyone have any thoughts on that? And I want to particularly come back to Mr. Bynes, because I'm sure you have some ideas about that. Go ahead.
Yes, I just want to say something from American standpoint. When you talk, well, first let's talk about how emancipation, what it actually means legally. Legally, emancipation, even a child, when your child reaches a certain age, that child, when it's no longer your ward, is emancipated. So emancipation is a process when you are responsible for yourself. It's like becoming independent as an individual. When you speak of emancipation here in America or the United States, in the States, there were people individually giving emancipation throughout the whole process. People trying to get individual emancipation, doing various things to be emancipating, either getting your money or being granted it. So emancipation is that process when you make that person responsible for themselves. That means that you're no longer the property of someone else, is emancipation. Now, that's why I say it's a process. So when you talk about the Emancipation Proclamation, you're talking about almost a statewide process that we're going to take all the people who are black now and say that you are emancipated. You're no longer owned by whoever says they own you to make you a slave. Abolishment in America, there were two things. The Emancipation Proclamation did not abolish slavery. You could have still had slavery. You know, I can say all these people are not free. That means that you still, it doesn't mean that slavery is gone anywhere. What abolished slavery in the United States was the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment made involuntary servitude, outlawed it. That abolished slavery in the United States. Did not stop some of the horrible things that happened to people, but it was officially abolished by the 13th Amendment. There were other laws, because we were mentioning about the abolition of the slave trade. The abolition of the slave trade just meant that we're not going to bring people from Africa anymore legally. Did not mean that they, like you said, it did not mean that they were going to stop slavery. Even in the Emancipation Proclamation, one of the crazy things about it is that it was worded to say that you're going to change your relationship from slave and slave owner to a boss and an employee. It even encouraged the people not to leave where you were, that we still need you to stay there and work, but you now become the employee of the person who formerly was your slave master. So it's a complex system, and it's a process that you have to try to, like peeling an onion, There are layers and layers to get to that point where you are at a point where you are actually both responsible for yourself and have equal rights to the others who were in a state of freedom before you.
Did anyone else have anything to add to that before I go to Mr. Bynes? We've heard the term freedom used, freedom and liberation. Freedom and liberation are perceived to be synonymous. Mr. Bynes, what's your perspective on that? Is there a difference between freedom and liberation? Have we been emancipated?
Great question. So, complex question. If up until about 3 years ago, my response to this question would have been that there is no inherent difference between freedom and liberation. However, in 2021, I took a course on the Black radical tradition, which radicalized my worldview and ideological perspective. And so 2 scholars that I want to draw on for my response would be Saidiya Hartman and Ronaldo Walcott. And so in her work, Scenes of Subjection, Terror, Slavery, and Slave-Making in the 19th Century America, Saidiya Hartman argues in obscure and provocative detail that emancipation simply constituted another phase of enslavement for Black Americans as they moved from the plantations to the punitive controls of the Black codes and Jim Crow. Hartman theorizes that what she calls the afterlife of slavery, limited access to health care and education, premature death, incarceration, and impoverishment, the slighted life chances that people still face, and the furious desire for freedom that comes with them. The hunting question Hartman returns to again and again is, did slavery really end? In 2021, professor and Canadian writer Ronaldo Walcott published The Long Emancipation, Moving Towards Black Freedom, in which he posits that Black people globally live in the time of emancipation, meaning that this is still going on. So as you've heard, emancipation is a process, right? And I would even posit for us to understand that process was bloody, it was messy, it was ugly. People would oftentimes, slave masters, my brother here recognized that Florida and Texas were 2 of the last states, right, to receive word of emancipation. And so what you saw then was various slave masters either taking slaves to different states where slavery was still official law, right? You saw people being kidnapped from various places. You saw particularly pregnant women being kidnapped and moved, right, to, again, states where they could legally give birth to a child, and that child would then become property. And so Walcott begins to talk about this process of emancipation, or the process of emancipation, but he also says that it's definitely not freedom. He argues that wherever Black people have been emancipated from slavery and colonization, a potential freedom has impeded or inhibited the process. Walcott coins this as the long emancipation. In other words, the ongoing prohibition or outlawing of potential Black freedom and the continuation of the juridical and legislative status of Black non-being. Walcott continues and contends that Black people have yet to experience freedom, and illuminates that being Black in the world, is to exist in the time of emancipation, in which Black people must constantly manufacture alternate concepts of what freedom means, and reality through expressive culture, such as music, song, dance, art. And so Black people must then continuously express or come up with expressions of cultures in the midst of what he also calls this Black unfreedom. And he says that it's this Black unfreedom that lies at the heart or the making of the modern world. The true attainment of freedom, Walcott asserts, will transform the global human experience because, as he offers, present concepts and conditions of what it means to be human does not currently include black people. And so, as I contemplated the question and my own perspective, I discover my own philosophical realities taking up space in very familiar territory. The constructive skepticist that I am attempting to hold on to hope that believes, right, at best, that we as a collective are indeed in the process of the long emancipation unfolding. Yet there's also a dark, pessimistic reality of my beingness that analyzes the historical narrative and present-day conditions of the West, particularly the U.S. empire, that provokes and pushes me into a position that would suggest emancipation has not happened. Otherwise, we would not still be wrestling with the concepts of freedom and liberation, which for me are not synonymous terms or concepts. For me, freedom is about individuality. Freedom is local. Freedom is domestic. Freedom is about civil rights, whereas liberation is about the collective or the communal. It is international. It is about human rights. And as I close on this question, and so in this space of thought and in commemoration of his 98th birthday on yesterday, I think about the multiple realities of the beingness that we know as Brother Malcolm X or Hajj Malik el-Shabazz. Brother Malcolm was very much about the domestication of the black freedom struggle for black individuals and the community of black Americans, and some might argue those that were Muslim. However, as I believe, his life experiences led him into a spiritual and psychological paradigm shift wherein, like Marcus Garvey or Kwame Nkrumah, Malik el-Shabazz understood that while individuals could be free, liberation was about the global collective whole of black people, thus becoming a framework of his Pan-Africanism. And so for me, when I think about freedom and liberation in terms of not being synonymous, again, I think that we understand, as Professor Wedderburn has eloquently already said, that we have to understand that I think individuals can certainly have freedom, right? We have the freedom to get up, we have the freedom to move about, the freedom to live our daily lives. But when it comes to liberation, I think that is one of the main reasons why conversations and discourses like this is important, right? As we talk about, it's not just about African American or it's not just about Caribbean American, but it's about the diaspora. It's about the collective, right, of the black or those that identify as black. It's about the collective global or international blackness, right, and the conditions that we currently live under, which I'm sure we'll get more into.
Thank you. And anyone have anything to add to that, or a different perspective, or one that resonates? It sounds as though what Mr. Bynes was saying resonates with what you indicated in terms of emancipation being something that you give yourself. But we still know that we live in a society where there are rules and regulations and laws. Mr. Davis, throughout the African diaspora, laws, policies, and procedures were enacted to keep slave owners empowered to keep the slaves oppressed. Reference has been made to that. Do you think that still occurs today? Talk to us about systemic racism. What's built into our bureaucratic governance structure that impacts whether and how our communities move forward, how we move forward as a people?
Yes, and to start talking, to piggyback on what David was talking about, as far as he was talking about freedom, another way to say it is independence. And I mention that because there's an African Adinkra symbol, I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, but I pronounce it as Fode. And Fode says, with independence comes responsibility. When I said emancipation was a child coming of age, think about that child coming of age, becoming an adult. What kind of adult is going to become? The child of legal age, but is he still staying with his mama? Is he still buying clothes that his mama gave him? Is he still eating the food that his mama provided for him? Even though he's at legal age, has he, and by legally he's emancipated, is he actually responsible for himself? And emancipation, as a definition, just says you're now responsible for yourself, but how you're going to use that right that you've been given is up to you. Like she was saying, that it's a personal thing. If you don't use your independence or emancipation, you can be living the same life you had as if a child is just staying at home, not responsible for anything, not doing anything. And that's why it's so important to have groups to realize that you've been given an opportunity that when we were definitely the property of someone else, you did not have. When you were the property of someone else, I like to, when I do things like that, tell people, you know, touch your shirt. And most of you would take that shirt and say, this is mine. But think of a person enslaved, they can't even say the shirt on their back is what? It's not my shirt. They can't touch their child and say, that is my child. Someone else owns that child. Someone else can decide if that child lives or dies, whether that child is with you or taken away from you. So we have made a step in a way to get the freedoms and the independence we want. But if we ignore the fact that that is now our responsibility, and that when we work through this process and try to, like I say, peel away all the onion skins, all the layers of the onions away, we are responsible, I think, for our plight. Because if we don't fight for it, we just say, okay, I'm just gonna stay with mama and still live off of her, whatever she can do, I'll just take that. Or are we gonna say, you know something? We have capabilities to work, to even to say how we're going to live, where we're going to live, and what we're going to do. And that's where the system part of it comes in. Try to work through how do we change this system so that the system stops blocking us from having our full capabilities with our cultural ideas. How do we do our cultural identity? Because I know we like to talk about race, but I like some of the things that were written by Cheikh Anta Diop when he said that, you know, the concept of race is something that's made up. And he called it, rather than call it race, he called it cultural identity. We all have a cultural identity. And what you have to watch for when you have a cultural identity is cultural aggression. That those of other cultures will try to fight against your culture to hold it back. And because they're fighting against your culture to hold it back, you have to, one, identify what is my culture and how do I save those things about my culture? Now, when Diop talked about it, he talked about the three things you can look at to try to start identifying your culture is historical factors, what he called the linguistic factors, and what he called the psychological factors. But he said one of the most important ones of those factors is the psychological factor, because that's where the cultural aggression happens. That's where it tries to hold your culture back. And that is a systemic process to always make you think that you don't, or not, sometimes not to make you think it, but to make the overall government think that this person does not deserve the same things that we gave someone else.
Mm-hmm. When you talk about culture, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I just want to, I think, tie in a couple of pieces. I think it's important to also know how we got here, right? And so as we talk about emancipation and the Emancipation Proclamation being signed on January 1st, 1865, right, being announced, I guess, throughout the United States by 1860 or 1863, and then being announced by 1865. But then it's also important to note that by November of that same year, we also then had the first introduction of something called black codes, right? And so we went from slavery codes, right, to emancipation, then to right into black codes, from black codes into Jim Crow, from Jim Crow into sharecropping, from sharecropping into something in the mid-1960s called COINTELPRO, right, which was established by our own government. From there, we saw things like mass incarceration. We saw the war on Black Power, as it's called. We saw the war on poverty. We've even seen the war on education. From there, we've seen, so speaking of the war on education, we could also call it the school-to-prison pipeline. We've seen things like redlining, experimentation, as the Tuskegee experiments, right? And so the destruction, right, of progress, from whether it's Black Tulsa, right, whether it was right here in the state of Florida in Jacksonville, right, whether it was in Chicago in 1919, but throughout, right, there were numerous of what we would call Black Wall Streets that were developed. And so I say all that then to tie back to something that Nadine talked about, and that was Joy DeGruy in her work around slavery. What is the extra title of her book? Post-traumatic syndrome, right? Slave syndrome, right? In which she asked the question, the psychological question. Through all of that, did anybody ever stop or pause and say, let's get some psychological help for folks that we're emancipating?
So when you think about the perspective and the examples that you gave that occur in the States, is the experience the same in the Caribbean in terms of systemic rules, regulations, laws, policies that are built in to keep people oppressed?
It is predominantly that, but it's also the fact that when these things came into existence, they came into existence where the people who were in charge built it to suit themselves. All right? And because they built it to suit themselves, as we moved over the years, what have we done to change that? Because if you look at, let's take the United States, for example. In the United States, when the Constitution was written, how many states did we have? Okay, 13. Who wrote it? Now, what a lot of people don't know is that there were Caribbean folks involved in that process, okay? Because you had the first Treasury Secretary was from the Caribbean, Alexander Hamilton, all right? You had other folks who were from other islands in the region. But they did not consider themselves to be like us. They considered themselves to be part of the elite. And so that came into being. Now we have 50 states. So what was good for 13 is now supposedly good for us now. But it isn't, okay? Because when you look at what we've done or not done, you have to see that the emancipation thing about being emancipated, Bob Marley said, emancipate your mind from mental slavery, all right? We are still in a stage of mental slavery because no matter what you do, it reverts back to what has happened to you or where you came from. Dr. Joseph Buchanan once said that when you look at indoctrination, it takes years for it to go away. I mean, he related to us in a study group one time about, sorry. He related to us, they were in a study, we'll get it after. He was traveling from Africa to England. And at that time, he was a known scholar, and they wanted him to be there. So he was traveling first class. So he said, here he was, sitting in first class, traveling with these folks. And around him, these white folks were putting their foot up on the seat and doing this. And he had to say to himself, I am able to do that too. But the indoctrination over time prevented me from doing that. So that is the problem. The political process is where we can make the change.
This is where I wanted to go with you.
And,
I want to keep it.
That's where we can make the change. it's up to us. We have to move away from the statements that, you know, I'm not interested in politics. You know, my vote doesn't count. They haven't done anything for me. And the point is, the most salient point in all of that is the fact that when you don't vote, you have voted to give the person, whoever is in power, the power to over you.
Exactly. But I want to stay with you. You have other comments on systemic oppression, and then but I want to stay on the political issue as well.
Okay.
I want to come back to that. No. You go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, what I wanted to say is that one of the legacies of slavery that continues to haunt us as Caribbean people, that is akin to racism, is the idea of colorism, and to an extent, classism. So when we talk about how does systemic racism play out in the Caribbean context, I wanted to bring those 2 points up, because what slavery did was to institute racism after its abolition. And racism is, we know, another system. It's another system of oppression. The traces of that have remained in our minds since abolition days, right? So when we're talking about 200 and something, we're still wrestling with the idea of who is privileged, who is deserving, who ought to get certain opportunities, to the extent that we have very large sectors of our populations today that believe that the fairer the skin, the better will be their life outcomes. And that is very much tied with classism. Because again, who were the privileged and the beneficiaries of the after effects of slavery were the so-called white Caribbean people, or the brown-skinned people, or the fairer-skinned people, right? So I just wanted to bring that up. I know it's not a comfortable conversation that we like to have, but it is necessary, because we like to say we don't experience racism, we are classist, right? But they are very much closely related. Consider them as cousins, if not brothers and sisters.
And we're not gonna leave there. We're not gonna leave this, and I'm trying to be conscious of the time, because we're gonna come back to that when we talk about our third objective of how we come together and what we do within our own communities. So I want to go back to Mr. Joseph. Participation in the political process is very important in the U.S. and the Caribbean. What are your thoughts about the dynamics, here we go, of race, class, caste, and colorism in the political process? How can we collectively remedy some of these issues in the future?
When you look at the Caribbean, before I even come to the States, let's go back to the Caribbean. The class-caste system that existed in the Caribbean is the precursor of the racism factor. Racism is a new phenomenon in the region. It was introduced recently over the last maybe 15 or 20 years, where you find they introduced this, the Negro versus the Indian, or the Syrian versus the, So over time, that has become a dominant factor. However, the class caste system, if your name was a certain thing, then you belong. And if your parents or your relatives didn't have a high job, a big job somewhere, you were not important. All right? Then you come to the States, where you find that the racism factor here, as it evolved over time, it became such a dominant thing that it really took over most of what we tried to accomplish. And even today, I mean, we're in the state of Florida, where this white man is trying to tell us how to raise our children, what we can do when, who we should call what books we are supposed to read, and okay, nothing about, without his understanding of what CRT is, no CRT, okay, no, nothing about history. So what am I supposed to teach my children or grandchildren about what has happened to us over time? How do we bring them along to the point where they can hold their heads up high and stand up and say, you know, like the guys in the march with Dr. King, I am a man, I am a woman, okay? When you look at the political process here, our problem is that we don't want or are unwilling to participate. The root cause of it is education. We have not educated our population as to the importance and the value of voting. Local elections are the most important elections for all of us. And when we realize that, when we get that message across to the people, you will see the difference. Here in Florida, we had more Democratic registered voters for years. Yet still, because of gerrymandering, we have a supermajority state legislature, so that they could now change the law. Up till recently, you had to resign to run. But because this clown is trying to run for president, okay, he changes the law, and the bigger clowns who agree with him and let him do it, okay, so now he can run for president and get back as governor, okay? So I think for us, we have to sit down and put together not even a 5-year plan, but maybe a 10 or 15-year plan to turn things around. And the only way we will do that is through education. Educating people that a local election, it controls the air you breathe, your services, you know, the schools, everything is controlled locally. And if we get people voting locally on a regular basis, they understand the importance. By the time the gubernatorial or the presidential election comes along, it's automatic because they know the importance of voting. So I think that's
Appreciate where. And just talking about that, adding to that political process and the importance of voting. Now this is my idea. There is a control of a conversation that when they do things for black people, they'll talk about welfare programs. But to me, when I look at how welfare has worked in America, I was saying, but how about all those white welfare programs you had? And one of the white welfare programs I say is the Federal Housing Authority. We talk about redlining, right? But do we realize that redlining was started by the federal government, making a rule that they would give help to Caucasian communities? That was a part of the original thing of it, that if it was a Caucasian community, you could get FHA loans in that area. Banks responded to that saying, okay, we have to find where these Caucasian communities are. That started the red line where we were living in, that what? You aren't Caucasian. We can't get federal assistance to buy you, to help you get that house. So you're red line. Now we call it redlining as the banks came up with this cute idea, oh, we don't want to give to black people. Banks were looking at the federal law that said that FHA loans could go to Caucasian communities. Started making builders decide when you build a house whether that house was for whites or for someone else. All because of a federal law that said that FHA loans could go to Caucasian communities. Mm-hmm. Now it's a thing that's redlining that's there, and it, it's a part of it. And to me, that was a welfare program for whites. But the difference in their welfare program is the houses they were getting were going to give them an intergenerational economics, because the houses you can get with the FHA loan, you own it, you can give it to your children, you can borrow money off of it, you can do many things with it. You can see the equity of it goes up. But when they do a welfare program for blacks, it's what? Public housing, you never own it. You can't give it to anybody. You can't get a loan off of it. You go to the bank and say, oh, I'm living in public housing, give me a loan. But that other type of welfare program for whites, and you'll see so often that's why you gotta get involved and start looking deeply into how these things are, and at the local level. And you'll see a lot of federal programs that after the civil rights movement, there were dollars that were given to federal programs to try to solve blight and slum in areas. Now, I was working as a reporter in Miami at the time, and what I saw happening is these programs to get rid of blight and slum areas was used to attract federal dollars to a local level, and they would end up in Miami. Do you know I'm gonna name some of the things that were built with money from black.
Briefly.
Go
ahead.
Bicentennial Park. The first Miami Arena. The second, the Biscayne Towers. All of these were built with money that was for the blight and slum in Overtown, which is the black area. Do you see it in the black area? When we look at the way the system works and looking at the local level, because federal money always comes down to the local level, and by the time it gets to the local level, it has been totally diverted from the black communities.
So what we need to do then is to not move forward with another topic until we get back to how we can collect that third objective that we're trying to accomplish today. What is it that we can do collectively? So the last question I have for all of the panelists, another intentional practice of slave owners was to create a hierarchy among the enslaved, whether it was between the house slaves and the field slaves or men and women. I'm talking about within group bias, discrimination, prejudice, and oppression. Is there a hierarchy, and we've alluded to this already, is there a hierarchy or a better than, less than mindset within the African American and Caribbean communities? We talked about indoctrination. Talk to me about your experience with that and where we can go, how we can address it, and where we can go from here.
50 years ago, I was a student at the University of New Haven. And I went on a soccer scholarship to the University of New Haven. We looked at the student government, the student activities that we wanted to do. At the time, there were 20,000 students at the school, most of them transient. And we couldn't find anything in the school for black folks. So we got together, and because of my experience previously, they asked me to, some of the black kids in school asked me to take the initiative, and I did. So I went to the dean of students, I went to the provost, and we couldn't get anywhere. So I went back to the group collectively, and now there were African American and Caribbean, because in this particular situation, it wasn't about African American or Caribbean. It became that, but it wasn't about that. So I said, okay, look, let's write them and tell them we were paying $75 per student in student activity fees every term. So I wrote a letter on behalf of the group asking them to take that money every semester and put it in a separate account that we can then create activities for ourselves. Oh, that raised a hornet's nest because I was going after their pockets now. So they did that. We did that. They objected. They said no. So we formed an organization called, we didn't form it. It existed 2 years before, but it got nowhere because they didn't put it on. So we revived that. And we said, okay, we now have an entity, the Black Students Union. We want it listed, and we wanted funds directed there so that we can have them. Okay. They decided student government, which was predominantly white because there was no black representation on there, said we're going to call William Shockley on campus. This was in 1976. President Carter was running for president. So they came to us and they said, we're having Shockley come up here. Well, for those of you who may not have heard, William Shockley is the one who said that whites are genetically superior to blacks. So I said to them, hold on. He's not coming here. They said, yes, he is. I said, okay. So I said, the only condition I would give to him coming here would be if we can get a geneticist to debate him. So I called the black geneticist, you know, Shirley Wesleyan. She said, Glenn, don't waste your time with that fool. I destroyed him on national TV, and I'm not going back on any stage with him. So I said, fine. So my response to them, he's not coming. Well, we're bringing him anyway. I said, okay. I had relationships in the ghetto. So I said, I'll bring Congress Avenue up here. And that's when we got them to back off. But as we gained the strength in the organization, the African American Caribbean started to rear its head. Because I was the president, I was from the Caribbean. I deliberately had my vice president as an African American. But as we began to gain power, that happened to create some division. So I decided, okay, I can serve, I've served, I've gotten up the objective, I give it up, you all can take over, and I formed the Caribbean Students Association. So, still remaining in the organization, but the long and short of that, though, ended up with me being almost run out of Connecticut. Because I was headed to a very nice party in New York as a student, going down, and I went to the train station to get on the train to go to the party, and I noticed that I was being followed by 2 police officers. Okay, so, you know, I sat, it was a 5 o'clock train, I didn't go. The 6 o'clock came, I stayed. So they came up to me and said, why aren't you going on the train? Said, why? You better get on that train. I said, or else? So they didn't answer, they walked off. I called the director of security at the school and I said, if you don't see me in the morning or you don't hear from me in the morning, you know where I am. And I told him what was happening. I also made a call into the community and said, this is what's going on. So finally, I stayed there until 11:30, by which time the party was really swinging, but I wasn't going to make it. And then they had their shift, and they came to me and said, we're changing shift now. I said, I didn't hire you. So that ended that. But the Caribbean, then years later, fast forward years later, we had to deal with the same Caribbean American, African American in New York. And then came down to Florida in 1994, and it was a major problem in the schools here, where you had the Haitian, Jamaican, and Caribbean students fighting with each other. We put together an entity that comprising of people from Sistrunk, Board of Ed, the different communities. That didn't solve the problem either, because it cooled it off. But circa, it is rising again. So I went all there to say this. We have got to recognize that when white folks look at us, they don't know where the hell we're from.
They don't.
Okay?
No, they
when
don't.
they look at us, unless we open our mouth to speak, they can't tell where we're from. So we are our own worst enemy by harboring and fostering that.
This is where we have to talk about this.
We've got to really move the agenda and bring something in place that can survive us, because we must change. If we don't change, all of this is for naught. Thank you.
Other comments, David? I like, given your training background, what are some of the things that you recommend or advise to help us deal with this hierarchy, this class, caste, colorism?
The first thing I would say is grace, because it's going to be a long process, right? It's going to be a very tedious process. And so, as was already said, education is the key, right? And so a couple of notes that I dropped here would be, one is that I think we have to, number one, anticipate, acknowledge, and accept, right, our sameness, but also our differences, right? My uncle and I were talking just before we started, and it's often said, particularly in the Black African American community, that sometimes the only difference is where the boat stopped, right? And so we have to begin to acknowledge that. I think the other thing is things like this, right, in which we would call, developing counter-educational spaces, right? So simply spaces where we can counter the narrative that's out there, right? And we can come against what's already there. For me, I think one of the things that was taken away from us is the idea of not only self-discipline, but self-determination, right? And so this idea that we can do for self. And I think that one of the differences, at least for me as an African American, that I see that that many of the Caribbean brothers and sisters held on to was that idea of self-determination, right? So when it comes to the political process, I think one of the grave things is that we won't stand up and disrupt the process, because we're already thinking about what I'm going to lose, versus what I've been at FIU now, Florida International. I went there very intentionally because I had heard about the tensions between African Americans and Caribbean Americans, but I wanted to witness it for myself. I understood the culture as what we call a Hispanic serving institution. And so in many of the Hispanics being what we would call white passing, and many of them white passing Cubans. And so I wanted to experience that culture for myself and really see what was happening. And so we're in this process, right, where we have to, yes, acknowledge that we're, all of the same culture. We come from the same place ultimately, and so we have to then acknowledge that and begin to come together. The other piece I would say is what is called liberatory therapy. We've got to start having conversations about what happened to us, not what's wrong with us. Something happened to us. Something happened to us, and we have to acknowledge that. We can't continue to overlook that. And so there's a sister out there that's developing a curriculum around liberation therapy, right? And this is therapy around being liberated, around healing our traumas, acknowledging that something happened to us, and because something happened to us, it's now past. And we know that there's data to show that what happened to us throughout slavery, or what happened to those that came before us, has now, the effects were so traumatic that now it's passed down through the bloodline. Right? And so we know that even now generations are being born already with something wrong, right? And so we have to begin to acknowledge that. Finally, I would say something that we talk about, particularly in the African American studies or Black studies arena, and that is we have to begin to redefine who we are, right? We often talk about we. The problem is that we don't know who we are. Right? We don't know what the we is. And so we have to come together and define the we. Because if we don't define, and part of the we is then also then acknowledging who are we to each other, and then who are we to the world, right? And out of that now we can start making some sense of what we call memory, right, making. So we begin to look, right, and see where our folks came from, right? We would talk about Sankofa and look back, right, and how we look back and learn today. But we also then begin to this idea of waymaking and beginning to understand how we made. Now, and with this, Dr. Williams showed us something in the back before we started, right? And it was simple as the head wrap. And the head wrap, there's a verbiage on it that points to the way that the head wrap was tied in a direction of the knot would indicate, right, as symbolic language, as we often had to do, that it would now suggest where we were to meet. It would tell a story. And so the other pieces that we have to gather and tell the story. We've got to stop allowing the colonials, right, or the colonizers to tell our story, right? And we've got to understand that the African proverb is true, that until and I'm paraphrasing, that until we as the hunted begin to get our own histories and tell our stories, we will always fall prey to our story being told by the colonizer or those that are in control.
So what I'm going to do, we're right at the time for the Q&A. Please start writing your questions on the cards that were distributed earlier so we can have an opportunity to get as many questions in as possible. Write your name and write who the question is directed to, and then Ms. Edwards is going to pick those up and we'll do the Q&A. But while that is happening, I want to give you all the opportunity. What is the most important? First, I need to say, this island space is the first space that not only acknowledges, even though the Bahamas and the other islands are not part of the formal Caribbean, acknowledges the entire Black diaspora. They are to be commended for that. This also is the first time we have come together to talk about within group differences openly that I'm aware of. It happens in the house, it happens at home and in other smaller organizations, but this within group hierarchy that has been established needs to be openly discussed and addressed, and I thank Island Space for giving us the space to be able to come together and talk about that. So what is while they're forming their questions, what is the most important thing you want to leave the audience with today?
I'll begin and invoke the spirit of one of Jamaica's national heroes, because he's looking right at me. It's Messiah Garvey, whose words we are familiar with because they were popularized by Robert Nesta Marley in the Emancipation Redemption song. But I wanted to point out that those words are not the entirety of the saying. And I suppose I want to leave this with all of us today, because we have emphasized the importance of the psychological effects of knowing ourselves, owning our space, and moving forward, leaving a better world for the generations to come. The words of the Right Excellent Marcus Messiah Garvey are, we are going to emancipate ourselves from mental slavery. And notice how he owned that. Mind is your only ruler. The person who is not able to develop and use their mind is bound to be the slave of the person who does. So we have to be intentional about educating ourselves, about our struggles, but also about our joys and our triumphs. We have to read the works of great Black thinkers and writers who have paved the way for us to learn about and understand African ways of knowing across all aspects of human activity, from law to medicine. We have the knowledge to empower ourselves. Educate. I want us to move from thinking about emancipation to education to empowerment. So to a large extent, empowerment becomes a reality when we recognize and affirm the strength of our diversity as Black people and work together towards achieving justice for all. We support each other in taking our rightful place in the world in the fullness of our humanity as we strive individually and collectively, not merely to survive or to fit in or cope, but to thrive and have agency and accountability, to realize a world where Black lives truly matter. And then in doing so, we can claim to have not only reimagined emancipation, but realized our freedom. Thank you.
I think the most important thing that I would like to leave here is that, yes, we have to do that, but we have to participate in the process. We have to put ourselves in a position where we have and can make a contribution to what's going on. You know, we come here and we say we're going back home, and 70 years later we're still here. But we have children who were born here. And so those of us who are not citizens become citizens. Those of us who have kids, encourage them, teach them the importance of participation. Because if you don't participate, you have to do what someone else tells you to do. All right? So education, empowerment comes through participation. Thank you.
And just to piggyback on those two from what Dr. Nadine said, because she mentioned Marcus Garvey. And one of the things that Marcus Garvey wrote in his book on his opinions is that the reason that Blacks are failing because they fail to organize. That it's organization that is failing them. And leaders like, great thinkers like Garvey, you mentioned Dr. Ben, we mentioned Cheikh Anta Diop. Between all of them, they kept trying to tell us that we need to start adopting, and Theophile Bingham talked about African philosophy. Now, a lot of times we'll go and we'll look and we'll get, you know, the African clothes, we'll get the African look, we'll say African things, but they start saying, are we really looking at African philosophy and comparing it to the other philosophies that are around us? To me, when we look at the Kwanzaa principles and it talks about umoja, it talks about kujichagulia, which is self-determination, harmony, and purpose, they talk about how you work together, Harambe. One of the things they say at Kwanzaa is Harambe. And Harambe means let's pull together. And if we pull together in the organization, and yes, it's going to be hard to get over some of the things, but if we stop thinking from the other philosophies that try to tell you that competition is always going to get you the best things, well, I say Harambe, pulling together. Competition is not going to help you pull a wagon if you're pulling one way and I'm pulling another. What makes that wagon go is pulling together. So the African concepts that Garvey, that Theophile Obenga, that Cheikh Anta Diop, that Dr. Ben were trying to show us, they were trying to show us an alternative philosophy from the mainstream philosophies we get so that we can pull together and make the progress, the political progress, the economic progress, the long-term progress that we need to be able to solve our problems.
Thank you. Parting words?
Yeah. I don't want to work. All right. So I guess I would say that going back to the opening video that we saw, I would encourage us that we have to redevelop what I would call the mentality of the Maroons, right? Dr. Asa Hilliard has a piece that he calls the Maroon Within Us, right? And so a Maroon, for those that may not know, a Maroon is just simply a body that refuses to be enslaved, right? And so we have to have the mentality of the Maroons. I think it's there that we will find ourselves participating in the process, right? It is that we will find ourselves, as I said, understanding that, as Dr. Jacob Carruthers said, indeed, our stride is wide because we're walking in the footsteps of giants, right? And so we'll be empowered through that. And so for me, it's about also then understanding the current generation, right? And listening and understanding that this is an intersectional problem, right? It is about race. It is about class. It is about gender, right? But it's also about age and ageism sometimes. And so we've got to pause, and we've got to begin, sometimes as hard as it is, we've got to begin to listen to our youth, right? And understand that, I guess in the words of one of my poets, as he would say, basically, fire next time. And the fire next time is connecting to the fire now. And the fire now, right, needs to be felt by older folks in the room, that we can now begin to understand even where the young folks are coming from, because they are in tuned and locked in for where we're going. So,
thank you very much. Let's give the panelists a hand. So without further ado, we've got some questions. So those of you who have questions, Ms. Edwards will acknowledge if you have a card.
Okay.
She'll come over and.
Okay, I am going to come to you so you can read your question. I'm going to ask you, in the essence of keeping things moving quickly, that you read directly from your card and direct your question to the panelists that you'd like to answer. Father, what will you start us?
Sure. In the South African experience, Ubuntu, Ubuntu, Ubuntu. We are one, and one we are, which is what I've heard. Thank you so very much. Now, at the same time, you're looking at a red man. Am I black? Am I black? Am I accepted into the African experience that you have reflected? Push at me, push at that thought, quickly. Soon after I arrived in this country, I heard about an organization within the Episcopal Church. And we're not torn up there. And I bust in my yard language, then look for me. And you said it today. You said it today. Soon after I realized, and it came to me in the most subtle way, I'm going to speak on it. It's uncomfortable. That being a foreigner, though amongst African Americans, there was a pushback and a push away at a red foreigner who no black. What's your pushback? What's your comment? And dig deep. Thank you very much.
I'll start. The idea of blackness is a political idea that was created to refer to people who occupy certain positions in society. We say a lot that race is a social construct, and the racism that was constructed here in the US is a peculiar byproduct, if you will, of the enslavement experience. So black is a label that has been assigned to a particular individual in comparison to white, because white has a meaning, right? And so in society, coming out of the system of racism, one is either black or white, because they are opposing ideas. African has a specific meaning. It means people who can trace their genealogical origins to the continent of Africa. Whether or not they do, they may also identify with the culture and the origins of human civilization, which began in Africa. So coming into a society like the US, where this hierarchy, this system has been so clearly defined, you are going to be treated as either black or white. This is why even Irish became white, because the history will tell you that when they first came to this country, they were placed in a particular social category that they were not considered white, because white meant wealth, it meant power, it meant influence, and it was reserved for people who identified as white. They were the ones who constructed it. And so black becomes a contra category, if you will, to answer, to use your word, the construction of whiteness.
Yeah, I would wholeheartedly agree, right, with Professor Nadine there. And quickly, I'll just say, so particularly here in the United States, whiteness, or we come into this construct of race somewhere around, in terms of codification or making it law, somewhere around 1681, after something happens that's called the Bacon Rebellion, right? The Bacon Rebellion is where lower class Europeans team up with black bodies or Africans, and they begin to rebel against the elite class. And as that happens now, the elite class now says, we got to do something before this happens again. So out of that now, we see this idea of whiteness, right, in which they now say, come into this identity category that we're going to call white, and now we want you to come into what I call identity solidarity with us. And as we come into identity solidarity, you're going to be grandfathered in, right? What Professor Nadine speaks to, and I'll challenge you to look it up, the 1790 Act of Naturalization, right, in which those coming from the Dutch that are coming, right, all those that are coming that have a lighter hue or are considered to be white, right, they're told, if you want to survive here or be counted as being something in these United States, then you're going to be white, right? And so we see this early on, and the Act of Naturalization has various iterations over time, right? And it goes from, 2 people being able to claim to 3 people to 14 people and back on down. So ultimately, we understand that black and white becomes the ends, right? And folks always say, well, why does it always have to be about race? It has to be about race because not only is it a social construct, but it is real, right? Your racialization is real, but it is also real because, as we would say, we charge white supremacy. We charge imperialism. We charge colonialism, right? And as we look at those various things, not that we use them as an excuse, but we always have to go back and tie to what we're experiencing right now to how it started then. And I would submit to you, a lot of the things that we're experiencing right now, we can go back deep into the 14th, 15th, 16th century, and we'll see the very same things happening, which, for me, causes some of my pessimistic ideology.
And thank you for those words. Again, I go back to the philosophy. First of all, we have to find, to me, or for me, I had to see that the concept of color defining race was something that was made up by Europeans when they were trying to justify the fact that they had enslaved people because of their color. So they came with this idea of making the races, the red, the yellow, the black, and sometimes they had, a whole bunch more that they all kind of think, breaking down of it. Part of what we have to do is we have to deconstruct that concept, that the color of your skin is what makes you a part of this movement to bring freedom to all and not. I think, again, Sheikh Anta Diop, when he talked about it from the standpoint of 2 modes of production. He called one the European mode of production, and he called the other the African mode of production. And he gives you a list on what's on either side of those 2, the African mode of production and the European mode of production. And to me, when you look at the things that he had on this African mode of production and seeing Africa as the cradle of society, that everybody came from Africa. no matter what color your skin, no matter where you branched off to, everybody came from Africa. And I think the title of his book kind of show what the real problem is. His book is called Civilization or Barbarism. That's what we have to look to. Do we want to actually create civilization, or do we want to adopt philosophies that are barbaric? Because when you look at some of the things that we're fighting against barbaric ideas. And we need to get rid of those barbaric ideas, because when you think that the color of a person's skin will determine whether they are civilized or barbaric, you're wrong. You can have people that are very black, Clarence Thomas, and they don't get it. So we can't just say that because the person has dark skin that they get it. But because that a person understands the principles that create civilization, create the Ubuntu, that creates the Harambe, or are they going by these principles that create division? And call it competition, or call it, to the victor belongs the spoils. And to me, I always thought that was one of the silliest philosophies, because it says that whoever can beat the other person gets what's messed up afterwards. And we got to get rid of those philosophies and start looking at some of the scholars and seeing what they're saying about, but the biggest part is, are you working towards civilization, or are you working towards barbarism?
Okay, so we're going to go to our next question.
All right, so good evening, panel. How are you? Pleasure to be here. My question is it better to build a community value system before we start to talk about the political or voting politically? Or should we do both of those things simultaneously, right? Because one of the biggest things that I think happens, especially in the younger generations, and a lot of black people have a tendency not to want to vote. And it's because we don't know if we're going right, we're going left. So I want to know, is it best to just build a community value system first, and then once we have that in place, then we vote as a voting collective or a voting bloc?
So do you have someone in mind you're directing that question to?
So that's both for Mr. Davis and Mr. Joseph. Yes.
I say both. And I think places like this, where you're combining art, culture, I think that's the African way. The African way of doing things is that art, culture, education all became a part of one thing. That even when I came in, you see the some of the carnival outfits, which is a pageant. But then when you start learning about carnival, you find out that each one of those troops that they are actually trying to bring a message to the community. It's not just about having a party. It's not just having fun. Each one is trying to develop a idea that they're bringing. And so I think as we develop it, we need to make sure that we do it in the more African mode of production, that we keep it all together, that we show them that we're bringing together community, that we're bringing together politics, that we're showing you, and like I said about Garvey organizing. Yes, you need to vote, but you need to vote in an organized way. Don't just think it's my one vote. You got to say, who am I, what groups am I looking at that we can make an impact by doing it together? So to me, we got to work on all of it at one time. And look at some of this beautiful art. This art can inspire you to do those things. The information they have on there. So places like this, and Africans even say sometimes that to have community, you must have ritual. And a ritual is, they believe that you don't have community without ritual. You don't have community unless you bring people together and put a part of, and for them, a ritual means part of it is organized and structured, and part of it you allow the spirit of the ancestors to join in with you to take it to the next level. So you got to bring the people together. You got to have that structured part of it. You got to have that part where you almost just call on the spirits of those who came before you and who will come after you to work with us to pull it together. So you need both.
Mr. Joseph?
Definitely, I totally agree that you need both because first of all, we have the capacity to do more than one thing at a time. And because we have that capacity, we also need to understand two things. You have a top and a bottom. You have those who have been here a long time and those who are now coming up. We've got to have them communicating. We've got to listen to the young people. We don't just hear them, but listen to what they're saying. Because, kids today, when they're born, they know to point at the phone to dial instinctively. So they have a contribution to make. So we put the whole thing together and we move it along at the same time. You combine the experience with the energy, and I think we'll be successful. But we can't not do it and expect to get anywhere.
And if I could, I would just quickly say, I think I agree with that, but I also think it begins with what Professor Nadine talked about early on, this process of decolonialization. I think oftentimes we start a lot of things, but as long as we approach that, right, even from an African base, but we're approaching it with a European mindset. We've got to decolonialize our mindset before we start to strategically plan.
Thank you for such an amazing conversation. I hear you guys touch on the topic of mental health, political power, right? What role do you think that spirituality and religion plays in emancipation and liberation of the Caribbean and the African diaspora? And that's for the entire panel.
So let me just preface that. I want to direct you all to the discussion that was held last month. I want you to go to Island Space. There was a whole conversation on diversity among Black religions, and that's where you're going to get the most fully informed discussion about spirituality. We don't have time for the entire panel to address that, but is there anyone in particular who wants to speak to that? But please go to YouTube Island Space and watch the discussion from last month.
I'll be very brief on that. People get confused between religion and spirituality. Spirituality is the most important thing because religion played a major role in where we are today because they false prophets, hence we have what we have today.
Thank you. Oh, you want to briefly?
Briefly, I would say I agree. I had my own experience, right? So you're looking at what I would call a former pastor of a Christian church. And once I began to make transition, because I was in it for real, I could no longer lead in that capacity. Not that I don't still hold on to some Christian ideals, but once I began to make the track of decolonization, number one, and I began to wake up to who I really am as an African being on this planet, then it caused me to go, to begin to understand where I came from and what all parts of that was. And when I understood that, I could no longer worship, as some people say, a white Jesus, right? And so I began to go there. So I think it's very important because we are a ritualistic people, we are a communal people, right? But we are also a spiritual people as we are the primordial beings of this planet.
And if I had to summarize, go ahead.
If I can quickly say one thing. The Black church is the greatest hindrance to us as a people. Okay, because they say one thing and then they sell out on the other end.
So the one.
Can I just say one thing though?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
One thing to that, and all of it's short and it's very short. I think when you look at African philosophy, it is more Christian than some of the things that they teach you in the church. If you look at what the African philosophy and the things that it is promoting, it is more Christian than the way Christianity is usually taught in churches.
Okay, so again, Island Space YouTube channel, you gotta go and watch that. You gotta go and watch that last forum. And if I were to summarize what it meant in terms of spirituality and religion, is all of we are one. All of we is one, however it goes. But the common denominators among all of the religions of African origin were discussed. Please go to Islands and look at some of the other things they have on there on the YouTube channel as well. I saw it. Yes. Any other questions? Yes. You want to come around and let us?
So here, okay. My question is open for anyone. I just want to say I think this is important because a lot of this stuff I think we talk about at home, and I think sometimes we get a insulated, feedback. So I think this is good to have this. So do you think that the emancipation experience and legacy is different psychologically for African Americans versus the people from the Caribbean? And if so, how is this manifested today? So, I mean, I think we touched on this a little bit, but, just psychologically, how was it, carried through for us, the people from the Caribbean, versus the African American experience of emancipation versus, the Caribbean experience?
Okay, so in the interest of time, I just want to know from Ms. Edwards, how much longer can we go beyond we want to respect people's time. We were supposed to end at 5:30. We can keep it going, but we need some direction here.
Okay, we'll go to 6.
Okay, all right. So from the young lady's perspective, when it's directed to the entire panel, we've got some more time. We talked about emancipation as a cultural experience. And it being something related to who we are, how we're reared, and where we're from. So I want to keep that in perspective, and I know everyone is going to have something to say. I want to direct that to Dr. Wedderburn because, and also, Mr. Joseph, you alluded to, or talked directly about your experience as a student in college. You are on campus every day. You are on campus every day. You see how that plays out, particularly in the 1980s when a lot of students from Jamaica and the Caribbean entered higher education in America. They went through it was culture shock for them because of the very thing you said, Mr. Joseph, that no matter where you're from, academicians, your faculty, your administrators still perceive you as an African American. So talk a little bit about that. I just wanted to put it into context so we stay on point. Talk about that.
Sure, thank you. What I would say to that is we all together as Black people, and I'm using the term Black deliberately, have a common adversary. That common adversary is the system based on the false ideology of white supremacy. It doesn't matter where we're from, as someone on the panel said earlier. The minute you step into the United States, it doesn't take long for you to begin to experience the vagaries, if you will, of this system of white supremacy based on a false notion that white is right, it's better, it is what is valuable and what should be aspired to, right? That plays on the mind. So when you ask about the psychological effect, if it was different, my answer to you with that question is no. Because the notion of enslaving people, eliminating their culture, stripping down their identity, making them to feel less than human was common, whether you were in St. Lucia, whether you were in the Bahamas, whether you were in Guyana, whether you were in Jamaica, whether you were in South Carolina, whether you were in Florida,
I can talk like
the experience was the same. And so it has left the same psychological trauma on all of us. So when we come into the US, speaking of the socialization process now, it takes a different kind of understanding to be able to make sense of what is going on. Speaking as someone coming from Jamaica, where I'm accustomed to seeing people who look like me running things. Coming here to be made to feel less than because of some stupid system that says the color of my skin is making me less valuable than someone who doesn't look like me. That takes some psychological doing. We have to work with each other. We have to explain to young people what this is that they are experiencing. It might not even make sense. Sometimes, you know, even at work, did that just happen? Am I getting it right? That is the psychological tricks that are being played because of this system that orders and organizes US society.
And from an African American perspective, I wanted to share that even being of Bahamian American descent, the first time I went to Nassau, at about maybe 9 or 10 years old, I saw black people on the money. And I'm saying, is this real money? You know, so it works both ways. But my experience visiting Nassau, Bahamas, or any of the islands when we have our family reunions there is something that's a wake-up call for me as well. I said, people, you know, in Nassau have been living with black people on the money all their lives. You know, almost all their lives. So it works both ways. Do we have another question?
Yes, we have a question, many questions. I have a question about the 13 amendments, where they say that slavery, servitude, all of that is okay, but the punishment for crimes, when we see that we have a large black community in jail, and that means they are slaves, and nobody said anything that those people are recognized according to the 13th Amendment as slaves. Nobody said anything. I am also surprised to see that Jim Crow law is in force in Mississippi, March 23, 2023, and nobody said anything. I am also surprised to see that how many black people have a generation of wealth. 1% only in the United States can say that they have something. Look, I have grandchildren. I'm really afraid about what's going on here if my grandchildren will be able to survive here. Or I can also decide to say, as we do in Africa right now, separate everything from what they provide us here or in Europe and create our own culture. Because we know that religion and education are reproductions of the system. We are going to reproduce the system again and again. It's why we are here for that.
Your question is?
My question is do we have to be afraid of United States right now?
And who is that? And who is that directed to?
Let me refer even back to the first question about, it's going to answer her question, but it's going to refer back to, is there a difference in the independence and emancipation efforts? I think everybody opposes oppression. Everybody. We had David mention the Bacon Rebellion, where you had these two groups, white and black, rebelling against the oppression from the powers that be. And the powers that be saying, oh, wait a minute, we can't let that happen. We need to set up a system that is going to have them fighting each other rather than coming against us, the big guys. And they decided to come up with this idea of telling some of those people, you're white, so you get more than these other people. we're going to be better to you than these other people. So everybody, even though your individual process, historical process may be different, all of us want to get rid of oppression, even white people. But they trick them, even trick white people, in believing that, and I'm keep going back to Diop, but he says that there was a philosophy, which he calls a European philosophy, that was developed on that concept of scarcity. There were philosophies that developed in Africa that were based on abundance. Because they keep pushing these ideas based on scarcity, that there's not enough to go around, they keep us fighting against each other. Because if you're going to talk about independence, you mentioned that we didn't mention some things about the 13th Amendment. We didn't mention that America went through an independence struggle to free itself from oppression. And in doing that, decided it was still going to oppress certain people. I think it's W. Du Bois that, or I can't think if it's W. Du Bois or John Hope Franklin, talks about if you really want to look at the freedom process, it starts with America freeing itself from British rule, which inspired the French to free themselves from the aristocrats, which inspired the Haitians to free themselves from the French. So this idea of independence is a human problem. It's something that we all as humans are trying to fight against. We can start, I think, as people who are of this African and Black diaspora, we need to start with ourselves, but we need to realize that this is, you know, one time when they first started off with the civil rights movement, if you look in the history of it, they actually called it the human rights movement. It was called the human rights movement. So we have to keep in mind that we are trying to do something that's going to better the human race, not these color races that have been imposed upon us.
And I thank you. You're gonna talk briefly because do we have another question out there? We have several.
Yeah, can I just, so to her direct question of do we have to be afraid? I don't think we have to be afraid, but we have to be aware. And I want to come back really quick to the point of the barbarism, right? We have to be aware of the level of barbarism that happens, right? Because it's moved from a physicality to a mental. But we have to understand, as Cedric Robertson would talk about, this idea of racial capitalism. And this idea, because capitalism is so strong, right? We have to be aware of what the system will do in order to hold on, right, to this system of capitalism and upward mobility so that this system that's been created of the have and have-nots stays intact. So do we have to be afraid? No. But we have to be very well aware, right, that this is what happens.
And I do want to say that I'd be remiss if I did not say that we do have white allies. Yes, absolutely. Abolitionists and other white allies who are also in the struggle with us. So we cannot just assume that we don't have allies. I just needed to say that we don't have white allies.
Thank you. Amazing discussion, really enjoyed it. Now, I've heard discussions like these all the time, right? And what I don't hear is what vision do we have for ourselves? When we were slaves, there was a vision to be free. And we got freed. But all the time we keep talking about what used to happen and what is happening now. But I never hear a collective vision. Because you know without a vision the people perish, right? We know that. Another thing I ask myself, who are we comparing ourselves to? What standards? Are we comparing ourselves? What do we want for ourselves? Are we looking at the white man, let's say the white people, and say we're trying to get there? What is it we are going towards? And until we define that, we'll just go around in circles.
And the question is?
And the question is, what vision do we collectively have for ourselves? Like the slaves had a vision of being free. Thank you. Thank you.
Anyone want to dive in?
I think we have to, it is something that we have to put together collectively. We have to, and that's why I said participation, gathering. Individual visions are not going to work because that perpetuates the fight among us. So we've got to come together, we've got to collectively get to the point where we identify what our purpose is. Otherwise, we're going to be wasting our time.
So I do want to say that given his background, Mr. Joseph has done a lot in community outreach. So here's where the rubber meets the road. If we can get a sheet of paper and a pencil and a pen, and you write your name, your phone number on it, we'll give it to Mr. Joseph because he's continuously active and actively involved. And maybe if, and I'm assuming that he could take that information and bring those people who are here before us together to start the process. He needs help in what he does, and you can tell from his introduction that he is committed lifelong to this. If we can get a sheet of paper, write your name and number on that, we will get it to him, and that's where the rubber meets the road. Let's get the work done.
Okay, unfortunately, I have, no, I'm not declining. I have another event that I am at 6 o'clock that I must go to.
We'll get it to you.
You collect it. I can leave a card or cards with you, my phone number, and you can coordinate it, and that'll be fine.
Okay, I'm going to defer to Ms. Edwards, and anybody else who's watching on live stream, if you want to become a part of moving forward with the next step, then get your information to us, and we'll get it to Mr. Joseph. Another question.
Yes, and I think this one is going to be relatively simple compared to the others. I've been hearing about our freedom being individual, and so my question is, if freedom is in fact individual and something we give to ourselves, then how am I responsible and accountable for true communal liberation? How does that translate? And second of all, what is the step? What do I do first? If I want to be accountable for communal liberation, how do I get from being the individual to being part of the community? And I wanted to start with Dr. Wedderburn because I thought you would give a good shot on that one.
All I would say as I leave is become a part of the whole.
Put your name on the list.
Yeah, I would say definitely become part of the whole. But I think we also, in terms of liberation, right, we have to begin to think collectively. Right now, we're still thinking too individual, right, or too individually minded. And we've got to start thinking about collectively. And so beyond this space today, some folks should already be thinking about, number one, what's my part in the process? So the question that we often ask, sit and assess, how do I participate within the system of white supremacy, even as black folks or black identifying people, right? And then we have to begin to also ask the question, what are we going to do next, right? When is the next conversation going to happen? When is the next event going to happen that's going to continue this conversation so that we eventually get to a space, right, where it's no more conversation, now we're ready for strategic planning, going back to the sister's question about what are we going to do?
And she directed it to Dr. Wedderburn.
I want us to be careful that we are not forgetting or diminishing the work that is being done. There are many workers in the fields. Perhaps we are not aware because, again, we still suffer from the fragmentation, another legacy of this horrific Holocaust, to use a term that has been, yes, Holocaust, thank you, that has been put upon us. And so we have to be careful that we're not forgetting that there are people who are working, and we want to respect and thank them for the work that is being done. Getting to know oneself individually and moving towards a communal action is a long process. We are talking about undoing the work of 500 plus years of damage that has been done to us. And I think sometimes we get a little impatient with ourselves and with each other, especially in this era where things seem to move so fast. We are talking about deeply embedded pain and trauma and suffering that has happened over centuries. So I would also ask that we be patient with each other and find the places where people are doing the work that will help us to get to know ourselves. That's deep, hard work. Not everybody does it well. Not everybody does it right, but perhaps Island Space can be one of those places where we bring those resources and we make them available to each other so that we can do that individual work that translates to the communal work. Because we need healthy people to make healthy communities. And that's a lot of work. Some of us are not so willing to undertake that work, but it's necessary. We have to do it. And I think there are places where we can find people who are already doing that work. And by joining our forces with them, we support them to move forward, but we also support ourselves.
Does that end our? Oh, go ahead.
Yes, thank you for this very enlightening discussion. I really appreciate listening to you guys. We talked a little bit about our just shared generational traumas and all what brought us together. But can you tell us a little bit about what gave rise to the division between African Americans and Caribbean people, and how has that sustained itself? How does that schism sustain itself today? The schism between African, what gave rise to that, and how has it sustained itself?
As I say it again, I charge it to colonialism and slavery, right? And so when I say that, again, I'm talking about a system, right? There is a systematic way and systemic way in which it's been set, the system has been set up to keep us in division, right? And so it happens through, number one, through the creation of various constructs, but it also happens, right, by embedding certain biases and stereotypes about, right, what I would call getting us to this place of intra-cultural wars. And so what we're experiencing is an intra-cultural war and really intercultural as well, right? So if we take it from the standpoint of race, right, it's an intraculture because we're all black people according to the system. So there would be this intracultural war that's there, right? Some of us don't want to be black, right? But then if we look at it from a space of ethnicity, now we're talking intracultural, meaning as a black American, right, I have to now begin to have the capacity to understand what black Caribbean or Caribbean Americans, right, what they've gone through, what they've suffered, and be willing. So part of my conversation early on was this is the work that we have to do. Be willing to have grace and patience with one another as we dismantle, right, or go through this process of unlearning to learn anew. And as Professor Nadine said, that's going to be a very long and tedious process. But essentially how we got here is that we have to participate in this system, and now it's by way of participating in the system that we now begin to take on these certain beliefs about each other.
And if I might add, it starts before then in the home. What do we hear? What have we heard our parents say to us about people from the islands? What have we heard our parents say to us about African Americans? What do we tell our children about the Haitian boat people, how they dress, how they wear their hair, and this is for all of them. Who thinks that because they live in a certain neighborhood, it starts in the home? And what we've heard and what we've been taught, and what our children hear in our home, and what they have been taught about Black people who come from different countries and different places, that's where it starts. If we can change the narrative in the home and explain all of we is one, then we might see some differences.
Absolutely. And I'd just like to add that the system is designed to do certain things to keep those who are in power on top. Again, in The Souls of Black Folks, Du Bois talks about the different types of white problem, racist, white bigots, the different type of white racists that he talks about, which is one of the things where he talks about there are white racists who hate you, there are white racists who are afraid of you, there are white racists who are greedy. And so he says that those are three. Sometimes we think we're working against one thing, but you're also you're working against a racism that breeds hatred, that breeds fear, and that breeds greed.
Okay, so what we're gonna do is go on to our next question. Is this our last question? We got more. Okay.
Never gonna end, is it?
Well, as long as they give me time, I'm good.
It's an important conversation, and I want to thank the panel and you, Madam Moderator, for taking the time out to make this happen in the island space. Maybe you need to look at that name, you know. It's more than an island, or is it? I'm a product of the street. I am not a scholar. I'm not as well-read as the panel is. However, I've been having some thoughts, and maybe it's my association with Khalib and the island space and some of my friends that I have made living in America for the last 23 years. It has given me it has educated me. And Professor Nadine Wedderburn, thank you very much for your words here. It resonates very much with me, not belittling any of the other contributions. I had the pleasure of a conversation with Ambassador Andrew Young some years ago. And he pointed it out to me that the second trip that himself and Dr. Martin Luther King ever made outside of the USA was to Jamaica. And his words, is the first place I'd ever been to where they saw Black people running everything. Black policemen, Black politicians, Black people in the banks. Okay, the other place that they had gone to before was Western Europe. I'm not sure if it was Norway or Switzerland or wherever. One of my thoughts is, with all of that background, I am looking at freedom, slave freedom from end of slavery, emancipation of, 400 years, thereabouts, right? How do we overcome, and this is the question in my mind, you know, where are we now? How do we overcome the education, the thought process, the mindset, where you have white people believing that they own Black people, and where you have Black people believing that they can be owned by white people? 400 years later, how do we overcome that socialization? I want to address that to you, Dr. Wedderburn. Thank you.
You're asking a Black woman from Jamaica to answer a question that concerns more than just me. educated or not. My opinion simply is that that is a conversation that has to be had with white people. And on both sides, yes. So between white people and black people, because the people who identify themselves as white are the arbiters of power and wealth. And they will do everything, as David said earlier, to maintain that wealth and power by any means necessary. I want to go back to say that it's not that some of us haven't made progress and are not making progress, but we don't have the power to change the levers of the system, as it were, the system, not the person. We certainly have agency to take control of our circumstances and situations, but we still live within this system. And the awareness is where every day that we get up, we are navigating that system, because we are not fooling ourselves that when we step outside, that system is not trying to work against us in one way or another. So the point I'm making is it is a collaborative effort that needs to happen, not just us trying to undo a system that really was created. Not just us that was trying to undo a system that was really created to remove any agency or power at all, give us nothing, and yet expect us now to come and clean up the mess. That cannot happen just from one side. It has to be both sides. No. Well, I can't answer that question. I can speak for myself and my people and how we can empower each other to make the best of existing within the system. The other part is for the people in power to do that work.
And that's developing a relationship with some allies, starting with allies are willing to have the conversation. Allies are willing to share the power. Allies are willing to invite diverse perspectives. So we have to begin to go to allies and ask that question of them.
Right. But I think, too, going back to the point of should we be afraid, we have to sit with the realistic contemplation of the why. And what I mean by that is, if I'm in power and I enjoy the luxury of power, what is it that's going to provoke me to give up my power when I already fear, because I know what you can do if you have the power and the ability and the possibility. So what we have to really sit and contemplate is the why. Why would they do that, right? And then I close with this piece. It takes me to, again, I'm a Malcolmite, and so it takes me back to Malcolm, and Malcolm says, there has never been a revolution without bloodshed. And so what we also have to begin to think, and I'm not advocating, but we have to begin to contemplate, will there ever be real change in this system as it's created now of racial capitalism, right? Imperialism, colonialism, or colonization? Can there be real change without physical, violent revolution? That's a question.
So our next question.
All right. Greetings, everyone. I want to say thank you to the panelists. African philosophy has been mentioned a couple of times this evening, and I know we're talking about emancipation, which means that we're talking about from the process of enslavement, right? And typically when we do that, as John Henry Clark said, the historian, that when we start from slavery, then we think that everything after that is advancement. So, what we're doing then is centering, the trauma. So the question is, for those who wish to explore, right, the concept and the philosophies of African philosophy further so that we can center not the trauma, but center the before, right? Because who we are, not who we were, but who we are before that process. What are some of the resources that we can, seek out so that we can inculcate that in our being as we move forward in this time? Thank you.
Oh, on me?
Who
On some of the sources?
Are you directing it to anyone in particular?
There are, so because you mentioned, I think you mentioned John Henry Clark, right? And I think before we've mentioned Asa Hilliard. We've mentioned Sheikh Anta Diop. So we've mentioned a lot of those sources. Dr. Ben Buchanan. So the concept is you have to look where you are and then try to relate it to Africa. It's best to start out, we were talking about when you start off with you. One of the things that Diop does in Civilization of Barbarism, he gives you one section that talks about social structures. There's another section that talks about math and science. There's one that talks about fossils. It's a thick book. You don't have to do the whole book, but you say, or it talks about art. There's so many entry points to understanding African philosophy that you need to find the one that speaks to you. And if you find the one that speaks to you, go back and look and see how does that relate to African philosophy, whether it's art, music, science, whatever. There's so many doorways to it, even religion. Either one you use, you can go back to it. Now, one thing Diop says is that this society has been kind of built on Greek philosophy. And to me, some of the errors of Greek philosophy. We already know a lot about it, but we have to learn about Greek philosophy, that Greek philosophy based most of its principles on Egyptian philosophy and Egyptian sciences. He believed that Egyptian sciences were based on African sciences. So he told us to study Egypt because it will correct some of the misconceptions you have from getting the scientific and philosophical points from the Greeks. And once you get it corrected, you'll be closer to the African philosophy. So he gave Egypt as a way of studying Egypt, as a way, as his sort of like his key, universal key, to be able to understand them. And Egypt does have, when you go, and anything, say, if you're studying architecture, you can go back and find out what were they really saying about architecture in Egypt. If you're studying dance, what were they saying about dance in Egypt? And then when you find out what they're saying in Egypt, then go and study Africa. Because Diop actually believed that we needed to see it from the Egyptian standpoint before we can understand the African standpoint. Because the philosophies that have been messed up for us by the Greeks started with the Egyptian philosophy. And so he said, but we've learned so much as a basis from that Egypt would be what would straighten out our thinking about life. And when you get to Egypt and they start talking about ma'at, they start talking, which is truth, and truth being harmony. Then you start saying that, wait a minute, we're supposed to be basing things on truth and harmony, not this thing that they're talking about, competition. And then once you start saying, okay, I'm basing things based on this Egyptian concept of truth and harmony, then things like Harambe start making sense. Because if you try to make sense out of Harambe, if you're talking about one of the philosophies that you find from Greek philosophy that I find that it permeates to a lot of things is this, what do you call it? Zero sum game. Zero-sum games. And zero-sum games mean one person is going to lose and one person is going to win. And the way it gets really twisted, anything you can do to stop the other person from winning helps you. To me, it's not true. Because you'll see it sometimes, even when you see in our society, when you see people deciding things about the other people saying, oh, we want to get rid of Social Security. Even though many of them are on Social Security. Why they want to get rid of Social Security? They think it's going to hurt you. And in zero-sum philosophy, if it's going to hurt you, it's going to do something good for me. But if you look at Egypt, Egypt was not based on zero-sum philosophy. It was based on Ma'at, and everybody should be treated the same. So there are many doorways into it from whatever you're in, but the basic pattern is whatever you're into, try to get it, and when you look at Egypt, try to look at it from an Afrocentric person that's studying Egypt, because if you go into some of the things that the Europeans have done in their study of Egypt, they're going to incorporate some of those Greek fallacies, like that zero-sum game logic. And once you do that, it will start straightening, getting in your own mind, from your own point of view, from your own life. It will show you that, that's why I said, when you look at African philosophies and you look at Christianity, you look at philosophy, you'll get a better understanding of it if you understand the philosophy of Africa that it came from, because that's where the cradle of society came from, was from Africa.
And quickly, I would just say, if you would also just begin to look at some of the African leaders, right? So a few people I said, like Patrice Lumumba and Kwame Nkrumah, right? You'll begin to, particularly Nkrumah's idea around the African states of Africa, right? It will put us there. The other piece I'll quickly add to that was, I even think it goes beyond Egypt, right? In terms of Egypt now, we know was influenced by the Sumerian culture. And the reason why we don't talk about that a lot is because there's not a lot of written history about the Sumerian culture. But now, if we understand the Sumerians, it helps inform what we understand that's happening in Kemet.
Question.
This is probably going to be the easiest question of the night, of the evening. So I didn't hear it mentioned, so I could not let the evening end without asking this. What role do you think schools, I think there's one place we can find everybody, right? It's the one common denominator amongst us. What role do you think schools play in all of what we just talked about? And I'm talking about specifically K through 12. We will not use Broward or Florida as the example, knowing what we know. So let's be general about it, but what role do you think schools play in helping with a lot of the things, especially some of what the gentleman just said, is why I had to just get up, right? In recentering us and getting us past and creating solutions to some of what we're talking about this evening.
I'm going to try and do it quickly. Schools, policy. Who gets to decide what is taught in schools, how it is taught, and who teaches? Going back to what has been said here, this is where every one of us can have local input, because all of us decide who gets elected to your school board, and therefore how the different decisions are made around curriculum, for example. Curriculum is also it's a hot topic right now, especially in Florida and other places. That is a question we would have to work out all night long, and we don't have time for that, and we're not going to try and do it. But curriculum is also very important. This is where we get to the what is being taught. Teachers. Who are our teachers teaching Black history, African history? What kinds of consciousnesses do they come into the classrooms with to impart this knowledge to many of us who are parents and your children? Who are these people who are teaching and imparting knowledge? Do they value the student who is sitting in the pews, not in the pews, pews would be church, sitting in the benches, right? So those are my quick answers, if you will, to that question. The role of school, it starts at the top. Who is making the decisions about policy around who are our teachers, how our curriculum is being developed, and how that job is being done classroom to classroom to classroom.
And I want to add another role, and that is the role of guidance counselors. And if your child has the opportunity to even see a guidance counselor, where are they directing their career paths? There's this divide between occupational programs and academic programs without any regard to or assessment of what's best for the child, as opposed to what's best for the reputation of the school and the school grade and where the school is going to achieve accolades. So that could be a whole nother discussion. But your guidance counselor, and you hear it all the time, for people who have made it a way out of no way, that my guidance counselor told me I could never be or would never be.
Right.
That role needs to be considered as well.
And Dr. Williams, early education is very important. Dr. Williams' work on helping your child find its pathway, I think you need to let them know what the program that you have so they can look at that. Early education is fine. And black people have always found out that they need to supplement early education. I know they did in my day. They were giving you things in the church and other places to let you get more. And I think some of the supplements that Dr. Williams has created to kind of get people to look at life from these various standpoints, that you need to be able to see them and know them and give them to your child so that they can get through some of the muck. Because some of the things they put into the education system is muck, and if you haven't prepared your child for the muck they're gonna get and how to get through it, that they're gonna be like our generation when we got out of school and we said, wait a minute, it's so many things they didn't teach us that you gotta learn now. And if we as parents and uncles and things get involved in it early to try to get those children so they can avoid some of the muck and get to the true purpose of education.
And remember the word school. School is about schooling, not about education. And so we've got to get back to the principle of education, which I would come back to Dr. Williams, which starts in the home. And remember who we are as a people. We are a people of oral history. We are often taught through oral history and language, right? And so what role does a school play, or should it play? It should be everything. But we also have to remember that the school, as we know it, is a byproduct of the state. And because it's a byproduct of the state, again, we have to sit with a very hard question. Why, as Amos Wilson would say, why would they ever educate our children, right, to overtake their own power? And so when we look at who makes those decisions about what's taught, right, and who's taught, when they make decisions about who's gifted, right, and who's not, we just have to sit and really examine, right? Examine gifted programs. Who's in those gifted programs, right? How are those gifted programs run? Why do our children have to be pulled and separated, right, from their classmates to go into this special-oriented class, right, to prove that they're gifted when we know that they're gifted already, right, and can be in communal, right, education. And so I'll leave it there because we can go on and on. This is my area.
Let me add one other thing to that, is places like this.
Mm-hmm.
Island space places. When I was working in museums, and you look at museum and you go and learn about museums, do you know that they show that people trust museums more than they touch teachers? The museums came on top of who, if someone gives you information, you're more likely to believe it if you saw it in a museum than if you saw it in church. Museums are powerful, but we don't take our children to museums. Do you know what impact it would have on your child if you could bring them and walk them through here and start telling them some of the things, or take them to the African American Research Library or the Old Dillard Museum? Take them to some of these black cultural places, and it will have an impact on their mind to be able to do some of the searches early. Because if you look through here, you'll find out a lot of the history that you weren't taught in schools, you were picking up on it. You were knowing what, and you're saying, where should you start? Start by going to some of these museums and seeing what they're talking about, what they have there, and use them as a launch point for how you can improve. I still say that we're talking about a vision. Our vision should be to improve mankind.
So
it start with us, but it improve. But your ultimate gain is to improve mankind.
Okay. So in closing.
We're good. I got a question.
You got a question? Okay, but before we get to your question, on the point about Egypt, when you look at the European system of education, it was stolen from the Egyptian per onx, in where those Egyptian schools taught to improve, as he said, the collective. Education was for the improvement of the collective. The European system, the education is for the benefit, survival of the fittest, the individual. And that is the difference in what is being taught in schools today. It is competition for the grade, it is competition for the admissions to college. And on Derek's note, without delay, if you want to find out about what it is that I do, the non-traditional approach that I take to guidance counseling, visit highered.life. Highered.life.
And two books, Stolen Legacy, if you don't have it, and a fairly new book called, particular for teachers in the room, called Fugitive Pedagogy.
Okay.
Question.
And to Derek's point, if you have kids that want to come to the museum, we do accept children's groups, school groups, and adult groups as well. Thank you.
Yes. Encourage your churches, your organizations, your everything to say, we need to take a trip to island space.
Amen. All right. Thank you. I don't know if this is a question or a comment, but 2 articles I wrote when I used to be a columnist for the South Florida Times. One was called I Am Caribbean. And it spoke about kind of being lumped in with, everybody being called African American. And I took a little bit of umbrage to that, because in Jamaica, we have the Chinese people, we have the Indian people, everybody is there, but we're all Jamaican. At the same time, you come to this country and they kind of blanket everybody as African Americans. And whilst I appreciate those differences, I appreciate the differences in our music, our food, our culture, and so on, it doesn't mean that we're all this. We're all Black American, sure, but we're not all African American. This woman got mad at me, and you Caribbean people think you're better than everybody. And that was the email that I got back after writing that piece. And I said to a friend of mine, why do you think there is this difference between how African Americans think of themselves and how they think of us, and vice versa? And that led to another article called Because We Have Heroes. And in Jamaica, we have national heroes, and they are all majority Black. I mean, they're whitish, but majority Black. And so we had Nanny of the Maroons, and you had Sam Sharp, and you had Paul Bogle, and you had, as Dr. Wedderburn says, people that look like me and her leading the country. Lukey spoke about Martin Luther King coming to Jamaica. I've heard that he went there to write his books because he was so inspired by the Black people that he was seeing in positions of leadership. And so as we evolve coming out of emancipation and where we were and where we are and looking toward where we're going, I don't even want to ask the question, what's the importance of seeing more Black people in those positions? But I'm just throwing the concept out there and just asking your feedback or thoughts on what I've just shared.
Well, I guess I'll talk about African American, because African American came as a term to try to deal with the fact that some people didn't want to call, we didn't want to be called Black, we didn't want to be called Negro, you didn't want to be called colored. And part of and African American was a political term that came in. I think it was, I'm trying to think his name, who actually started, that really pushed it for African American. It was supposed to be trying to get a term that was inclusive. It doesn't do it very well, but it was trying to include everybody. It was looking at, in fact, when it was made, it was looking at American as the Americas, not as the states. So it wasn't saying African American means African United States of America. It was supposed to be African in North and South America. That's what the term was supposed to be talking about. And the islands are in the Americas, but when we say because the United States has like taken over the term America, when you make African American, people think that you're only talking about the states. So the term is inexact as far as trying to reach something that's all inclusive. But what we're looking for is what is that term that we will one day come up with that will make everybody feel that they're included in. Because if you say black, then the people will say, well, you know, I'm light brown, I'm orange, you know, they'll come up with all these things. So we're trying to find and still looking for a term that is all inclusive. African American was trying to make it inclusive by talking about Americas as an American, not as a United States, because we didn't call ourselves African United Statesers. But it's still not exact, and I think we're still looking for a term that's going to give that type of inclusion that other people will also feel that they are part of it.
Right, and another term that has been perceived as more palatable is to say you're of African descent. Right. And then you own your culture, the African culture that you represent.
The problem with the human race is now that this concept of race divisions is so prevalent now that
makes too much money.
Yeah. The war, yeah.
One of the things that I have always said when in the midst of arguments about better than, less than, what's preferable, is that the only thing that we need to be able to erase the divide among all of us is aliens. We need aliens to come and make the distinction between who is a human being and who's an alien. All of the human beings will then coalesce as human beings to do whatever they need to do to address alien population.
And
Exactly.
On a serious tip, to get back, so the ultimate goal is humanity.
Mm-hmm.
But if we go there, right, the powers that be understand there's no need for any of the other structures.
Mm-hmm.
And so now what are they going to do? So that 1-2% of the ruling class keeps this going because they recognize now that if we let them understand their original sovereignty,
Mm-hmm.
then we lose everything, right? And so rather than redistribute power economically, however, they rather keep the divisions going because of greed. And somebody said to me, as I close, somebody said to me one time, even if racism ceased, right, to exist, we still have racism because it's so ingrained in the fabric of who we are, right? So.
So I'm going to turn it back over to our host to close. Thank you so much for this opportunity, and thank you all for staying.
I want to thank all of our panelists and our moderator this evening, Dr. Wedderburn, Mr. Glenn Joseph, Derek Davis, David Bynes, and Rozalia Williams, right? Dr. Rozalia Williams. And thank you to all of you. It's been more than 3 hours and you're still in here, which is a testament to the content of the panel this evening. We want to thank our funders and supporters again. Before you go, if you got one of those little pieces of white paper, that was your pre-event and post-event survey. Please leave it with somebody at the front so we can get your feedback on what you thought. What did you think of the panel? All right. So hopefully we'll see you back here for the next one in a few months, but thank you all so much. We are going to, let me just kind of put it here. Right? Can you see me in TV land? We ask for, every time we do an event, because Island Space is a nonprofit, we're a private nonprofit, we are privately funded. So every time we do an event, we pass the bucket like they do at church. So since you're still in the pews, we're gonna grab the buckets over there and just pass them around the room. If you have $5, we'll take it. If you have 10, we'll take it. Preferably 1,000 is great. But whatever you have, we appreciate. Thanks again to our panelists, and have a great, we'll see you all again. The museum is open weekly Thursdays through Sundays, 11 a.m. to 7 p.m. And it's typically $10 for adults, $5 for children. But again, thanks to our sponsors, the Florida Humanities and the Community Foundation of Broward, this was all free to everyone here today. So thank you. All right.